Well, hello and thank you. And thank you in particular for joining me as we continue our investigation into the book of Proverbs, a book that has certain challenges to it because it doesn't have a storyline, as I've noted before, but rather it's a series of exhortations, instructions. Some of them are just simple aphorisms where he imparts some quick, quotable bit of wisdom that I find incredibly useful. And as I've said at the very beginning, I have committed really to reading a chapter a day for probably the last 20 years of my Christian walk. I thought it would make me a whole lot wiser. It's just a bit wiser, but nonetheless, it's important because one of the dynamics that we find in the book of Proverbs is this contrast. Basically, as we talked about last Friday, he says, to us, if you accept my words, and that acceptance means storing up, you're turning your ear to hear it so you don't miss it. I'll talk about cupping my ears so I can hear what's being said. And it goes on, applying your heart, calling out, crying aloud for it, looking for it, searching for it. He says, basically, this is a very intense and focused effort to really attain wisdom. It's not something that you sit by passively, looking at your phone or watching a video and hoping that somehow wisdom will, through some kind of psychological or mental osmosis, will suddenly pass from the outside into your brain. But rather, he says, if you do these things, then you're on the path of gaining and increasing the degree of wisdom and insight that comes with really kind of the interaction of scripture and prayer and day-to-day life. Experience, of course, is one of the great teachers, but oftentimes we have experiences that we don't know how to interpret because we don't have a biblical foundation. And that's what the Bible does. When I experience things, I can begin to analyze it in light of what God said I should expect. And the consequence is that I become wise rather than seeing an event as being setting me back or hindering me from going forward. I might realize that it's a teaching moment in my life, a way of God. God is really not only purifying my life, but also taking me to a deeper life and understanding of his will. And so you have these contrastive things, he says, if then. You have the fool and the wise man, the faithful man and the unfaithful man, and on it goes in all these dynamics. And it's always this comparative. And it's important because that's how we define things, really, is by comparatives. That if I can look at one thing that's good and compare it to something that is bad, then I have this comparison that helps me, when I have the opportunity, to choose the good and reject the bad. When you live in a world today where the meaning of words is becoming scrambled and the idea that there is no absolute right and there's no absolute wrong and there's no absolute good or evil and so forth, you find that people have experiences that they perceive as being unfortunate, but they have no mental equipment in which to process those events and to move forward or even to utilize them in an effective way. And so that's where I find that Proverbs is so helpful, because we often used to encourage people in the reading of their Bible by saying to them, read it before you need it. And I find that when I read the scriptures and even the Proverbs, there may be Proverbs there that I don't completely understand. And some of them, I have to admit, I've just read them and said, I don't have a life experience or reference point that I can see how that applies to me. And yet over the years, I found more and more of those passages become not just instructive, but they become incredibly relevant. Suddenly I realize, okay, God, I see what you're saying to me. And that's kind of the dynamic we're going to look at this week to some degree, because what it does is really contrast the moral character of people. It talks about how some people are good and faithful and true, and some people are not. They're wicked. And wicked isn't a word that we like to apply to people, but it's something that all of us kind of participate in at some point, because wickedness is anything that takes me away from God and my relationship with him. And goodness is anything that draws me close to him. And the reason why he tells us we want to be insightful in regards to that is because it really has a profound effect upon the final destination of your life. I mean, I can use many illustrations from my own life. I mean, my wife and I have been married nearly 55 years here, coming up in June. And it's kind of amazing because I have to admit there have been many, many occasions where we were at wit's ends with each other. And we found that other people we knew decided that was the end of the marriage and they walked away. And my wife and I always understood that nothing good can come from that decision. that we don't use the D word in conversation. It's just not an option because we know it's not God's will for our life. And we also know it won't lead us to greener pastures. It'll lead us into the desert of life. And many people are living desertified lives. They're wanting really kind of the freshness, the joy, the encounter that makes life kind of fun to live and worthwhile, purposeful, and fulfilling. And it's because they made choices not to do what God said not to do. They chose to do it instead. It's really kind of seen from the very first parents we had with Adam and Eve, where they made that critical, pivotal choice, fateful choice, to simply choose to believe what the serpent had to say rather than what God had to say. And so that's why we left off last week with him saying that if you search for wisdom as if it was a hidden treasure, then, he said, you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. And you might sit back and go, wait a minute, I'll understand the fear of the Lord. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that I'll understand why fearing God is the wisest thing that I can do. It's the beginning, a place where wisdom really starts. And what that means is that I take God and his words seriously. Not just literally, as I often say, but I take it seriously, that when God says don't, I take that really seriously. And when he says do, I strive to do the thing that he tells me to do. And sometimes it takes some experience or some efforts on my part to come to a place where I understand how to do what he wants me to do and the way that he wants me to do it. I think that it was one great missionary who said, if you do God's work in God's way, you'll never lack God's provision. And so that becomes the challenge, not only to do what God tells me to do, but to do it in the way that God would do it. For example, we see in the church today many times that people say, well, we want to do evangelism. And so they begin to subscribe to all sorts of slick and clever marketing ploys in order to persuade people to come to Christ. They use what we would call carnal efforts to draw carnal men to Christ. And then they wonder why they have a church of carnal people. And you realize that we need to do God's work in God's way, not just simply in the way that we want that. And that's where he goes on to tell us that for the Lord gives skillful and godly wisdom. He gives that to us. It's something that's imparted to us. It's not something that we just learn in the sense of educating ourselves. It's not like you can memorize a passage of scripture or memorize a proverb and suddenly it becomes integrated into the living experience of your life. It's when we basically seek to apply it that God imparts to us. He opens our understanding. He creates a depth of perception, and where we can both skillfully and in a godly way use the wisdom that he gives to us. And he tells us where that comes from. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. What's his mouth? It's his word. So again, it's this thing of when I prayerfully approach the scriptures and I read it daily, that God starts imparting to me wisdom that will add to my skill set as a human being and for me as a teacher or a pastor, and it adds to my godliness in regards to those things, that it's not just a matter of saying, how many numbers can I accumulate? It's not looking at life metrically, but looking at life spiritually. And that's why he says that when you do that, you will find the secret of both victory and safety in your life. Because when it's all said and done, we just want to do what we have to do in the most safest and prudent way. And we want to be victorious in living out our Christian life. And that's why he says to us in verse 7 that he holds victory in store for the upright. Now, keep in mind, who has the victory? Christ has the victory. He holds the victory, but he's storing it up for those who walk uprightly. He doesn't give it to just anybody. So my point is that you may win at something and not have the victory because you'll find yourself in an endless pursuit of another emotional or psychological high. But he says he holds the victory, and he not only gives you victory, but he also keeps it safe. He's a shield to those who walk blameless. For he guards the course of the just and protects the way of the faithful ones. Excuse me. So many times what we do is become obsessed with attaining or gaining victory or winning over something. But, as my pastor said, and I've quoted many times, if we strive to gain, we'll have to strive to maintain. So the problem is that it says when you become rich, he said, not only his riches increase, he says those who eat of them increase as well. So you find yourself having to not only strive to get something, but then now you have to work overtime to protect it so it's not taken from you. And what God says, when I give you the victory, you can trust me to also become a guard and a shield and a protector around that thing so that you can enjoy the victories that I give you, and you can rest in those things and not be living a life driven by striving and self-protection and so forth. For me, I mean, I remember, I hate to say it, over the years, there have been many people who have aspired to replace me. And there's been times when I wish there was somebody who would step up. The whole point is that I realized long ago that because God had called me to the position I'm in, that nobody else can take that from me. God can give it to somebody else, and and in that moment, it will be relieving me from the burden, giving it to somebody else who is more prepared or more equipped or younger to do it. But the whole point is that I need to be faithful with what God has given me, not only today, but until the day when God says, I've called you to something else. And so, you know, I never worry about that. I never sit up there and think about somebody's trying to replace me or overthrow me and that thing. It's really like my fate is in God's hands in every regard. And the more I believe in that, the more at peace I'm going to be in my life, because God gives me victory and he's the one who protects the victory that he gives to us. Hope that made sense. Well, we'll continue tomorrow. Blessings.